Cheers, guys. Epix911, welcome to the Elitist Geek. Sega. What does Sega mean to you? Anything? Any more? My bet is that if you're a young millennial, Sega means absolute shit. Literally and figuratively, because they haven't done much. There was a time, and older gamers like myself will remember this, there was a time when Sega dominated the industry alongside the greats like Nintendo, Atari, Commodore. Granted, it was a long time ago, but there was a time when they produced hardware that was the envy of other console makers. There was a time when Sega didn't give a shit about the kiddie market. In other words, they produced for the sophisticated gamer, the mature gamer. They went after that marketplace with absolute zeal and abandon. They wanted to capture that demographic. The teenager, that was the rebel, the young adult, hell, the older gamer. They didn't give a shit. They wanted us all. And they brought us all on board. Gamers had an alternative. And to recognize that alternative, we got to go back a little bit. In the history of consoles and computers, there's been Davids, there's been Goliaths, there's been heroes and anti-heroes. But almost without fail, every great console or computer maker had his nemesis. A few companies had several. For example, someone my age will remember that the first big console rivalry was Atari versus Intellivision. Intellivision was a product of Mattel, and Atari later would become a product of Warner, but for all intents and purposes, we're just going to not use the parent companies. Let's just talk about the companies themselves. Atari entered the market with their Atari 2600 VCS. It was the first gaming console to offer, multiple cartridges to the mainstream. Odyssey, 2000, Intellivision, ColecoVision were all competitors. But pretty much the Atari from 1977 to 1983 was the big kid on the block. And its largest rival was arguably Intellivision. It was one of those cases very similar to VHS versus Betamax, where, and my family was one of the dumb families that supported the Betamax, so let's just get that right out in the open. Now, I maintain to this day that the Betamax was better technology, but better technology doesn't always win the day. Case in point, the Atari 2600. You see, it wasn't the best of the bunch. In fact, you can dig up almost any game on the Atari 2600, compare it to its competitors at the time. The Atari 2600 looked noticeably worse, played noticeably worser. It was almost no comparison, yet it enjoyed unparalleled success. Take a look at the game Donkey Kong, and I'll see if I can find it for this video, and I'll place it in the screens while I'm yapping here, but Donkey Kong on the Atari 2600 was a fucking abomination. Like, I'm serious. It was absolute ass. It was so bad. Yet we flocked to it. We played it because here was a game that we loved in the arcades or the corner stores on our home video console, right? You take a look at ColecoVision's Donkey Kong. And not only did it have more levels than the Atari 2600, but they were almost arcade perfect. Like, night and day. The Atari 2600's Donkey Kong looked like some puked up gingerbread man gorilla wannabe, whereas the ColecoVisions actually looked like Donkey Kong on the arcade. And yet, Like I was saying, the Atari 2600 was the most popular. Enter the video game crash. Fast forward a few years later, and stateside, and I'm Canadian here in North America, the Nintendo Entertainment System, or the NES, was released. And at that time, Atari had moved on. It was a slightly different incarnation of Atari, and they had pretty much abandoned the console market. Yes, there were attempts with the 7800 to revise, and the Jaguar, but for all intents and purposes, the Atari had abandoned the console market in favor of the computer market, in which it also had a famous competitor, namely Commodore. But back to the console things with the Nintendo. Nintendo, for a few years, enjoyed almost a monopoly. Then an upstart company who had been producing arcade games decided to enter the console market. And that was none other than Sega, with their Master System. I actually have a Master System, and damn it, I should have brought it for this video, but I'll do an old school console video, and we'll show you the Master System, because it's in a box from the Man Cave. If you haven't seen that video, the Man Cave rises. It will be built. But anyways, I moved all the shit out of there, including the Master System. But North America, Europe, and Japan are, by and large, the big players in terms of worldwide console sales, at least at that time. And the NES enjoyed a monopoly in North America and just in Europe. But there were places like South America where, even years later, the Master System from Sega was much more popular. I believe that ultimately sales in a country like Brazil, which had 150 million people at the time, the Sega Master System was leagues more popular. It wasn't even close. The Sega Master System, again, was also another classic example of the superior hardware. While the NES enjoyed all the best arcade ports, Sega was pretty much stuck doing their own ports for their own games, but there were a few ports that were absolutely stunning. And one of those, to me, was an RPG by the name of Ultima 4, Quest of the Avatar. Ultima 4, Quest of the Avatar was, and still is to this day, my favorite in the series. I liked a lot of the Ultima games, but Ultima 4 was by far the best. While the NES had versions of Ultima, they were dumbed down console, little children's games. Not so with the console version on the Sega. The Sega Master System had a version of Ultima 4 that was arguably better than the Commodore version I was playing at the time. It had the music, it had better graphics, and most importantly, it wasn't dumbed down. It was essentially the game, but better. Where Sega really hit its stride was in the late 80s and early 90s with the Sega Genesis. The Sega Genesis was Sega's answer to the Super Nintendo, which Nintendo had released. And again, you could argue that Sega was the better machine. Now, before I get flamed with comments, yes, I recognize that the Super Nintendo was better graphically. Absolutely. It was capable of far more colors than the Sega Genesis. But the Sega Genesis had a Motorola CPU inside, and it was, for the most part, a faster processor. In other words, while you had a great graphical processor on the Super Nintendo, games tended to slow down when a lot of shit was flying around on the screen. They got around that, with some trickery, namely the Super FX chip, which was a cartridge embedded chip that ultimately allowed things like Star Fox, right? But that wasn't native hardware. It was custom hardware thrown into the cartridge. The Sega Genesis itself, and you can look at games like Turrican, for example, they play fantastic on the Sega Genesis. Sports titles as well, and you guys know I'm not a huge sports fan, but if you were a sports fan, you didn't go to Nintendo. You did not go to the Super Nintendo. You went to the Genesis. And to this day here in Canada, which is a hockey-mad, hockey-fucking-crazy nation, you ask anybody from the 30s to my age in the 40s, the best historical NHL game, and almost to a person, they will answer back Sega Genesis NHL 95. It was such a popular game that it was almost always sold out, and the used and rental cartridge market was abuzz trying to keep this game in stock. So the Sega Genesis, it had a lot of success. Then Sega started to misstep. And you could argue that Sega Genesis was the height of Sega's prowess. During that time, they were still a big player in the arcades, and some of my favorite arcade games are from Sega. They were a big player, number 2, firmly, without even a close number 3 in the console market. Then enter the Sega Saturn, which was a fantastic machine, but Sega was starting to lose its identity a little bit. It started to panic. And that didn't actually start with the Sega Saturn. It started a little bit before with that very popular Genesis. You see, they answered the Super FX chip with hardware wizardry of their own in the form of the 32X expander, which allowed 32-bit quote-unquote games to be played on the Sega Genesis. The add-on was bulky, unwieldy, unstable, but it worked, and it allowed players to play games like Doom, which was the PC sensation at the time, on their Sega Genesis. Then there was the Sega CD expansion, which catered to the CD fad at the time, and ultimately, which would become the mainstay, is CD-based games, right? But at that time, they tried to cover too much. And they created a lot, but none of it really sold very well. When they released the Sega Saturn, I mentioned they had a bit of an identity crisis. You see, they didn't know which way to go. The market at the time was gearing up to firmly start heading in the 3D direction. And Nintendo, and at that time the Sony PlayStation, had a bit of a relationship. They were both working towards a common platform. Ultimately, Sony took over the technology and launched first with the Sony PlayStation, which was a 2D capable machine, but its strength and its focus was really 3D graphics. The Sega Genesis was almost the opposite. It could do 3D, but it was really, its strength was as a 2D console. So what you ended up with were some great arcade games based again on Sega's arcade intellectual property. But you had some other games, and Knights to this day. I mean, there's some fantastic games, don't get me wrong, on the Sega Saturn, but they didn't really do the 3D justice because they just didn't have that capability built in. So what happened is they prematurely abandoned the Sega Saturn and put all their eggs into the basket of their Dreamcast. Now, as with NHL 95, you ask most people to sum up the Dreamcast, and most people's comments will be, it was a console that was ahead of its time. And I would absolutely agree with that statement. Just a quick sip here. There are some games on the Dreamcast that hold their own even to this day. To 2015, they still look and play fantastic. And one of those games is Jet Grind Radio. Other games like Crazy Taxi, they play and look phenomenal. The problem was that panic that Sega had been feeling the last almost a decade, or really half decade to a decade, was really firmly entrenched by this point. And ultimately they would pull out of the market. And you could do entire video series on why Sega left the hardware market, but suffice it to say, the end result was they left the hardware market. And that absence has really, really been felt by gamers. Microsoft filled in the gap, but they've never really been the type of competitor that Sega was to Nintendo. One of the things that you could argue about the Sega and Nintendo relationship is they always pushed each other to be better. That wasn't so much the case with the Sony PlayStation. The Sony PlayStation knew what its strengths were, and it catered to those strengths, and it didn't try to reinvent the wheel each time. It just basically became a better 3D machine with each iteration. The Sony PlayStation 2 was a better 3D machine than the PlayStation 1, and same with the PlayStation 3 and the PlayStation 4, and currently the PlayStation 4 is the ultimate 3D machine of all the consoles in terms of hardware prowess, in terms of performance. You know, the Xbox One comes in second performance-wise, and the PC arguably still the best, depending on how much money you throw at it, right? Nintendo has never followed suit in terms of hardware prowess. To them, it was always innovative gameplay, and they stubbornly stayed cartridge, you could argue, way too long. They came up with different ways of relaying games, whether it's 3D on the 3DS, whether it's unique controller support with the Wii. They've always been about innovating the gameplay experience as opposed to being the best technologically. That wasn't the case back when they had their rival Sega. So anyways, that's the background on Sega. And Sega CEO wants to win back that trust, because what happened was when Sega left the hardware market, not only did they leave a void, not only did they leave hardware for software, they abandoned all the creativity that had made them so fucking successful. And excuse my language, but I get passionate about this because Sega was always about quality. And if you look at Sega's games from the last 10 years, they've been anything but. They've literally been shit in plastic. I haven't bought a Sega game. I haven't been interested in Sega game literally since the early 2000s in the Dreamcast, because they've all been forgettable, horrible, quick ported, quickly programmed pieces of shit in plastic. The CEO has come forward, Hajime Satomi, and I'm probably butchering that, but Hajime has stated that he recognizes it. Now, holy shit, you think? Yes, it's late. I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt, because at this point, Sega couldn't possibly hurt itself more. I mean, they're pretty much out of the public eye. Every once in a while, there's a rumor that they're going to enter the hardware market again, and believe me, if they had the right backing and the right game plan, they could be a successful player in the hardware market again, but it's not likely to happen. But games, which is what they were always about through the 70s with their arcade machines, is still a possibility. So it's going to be really interesting to see what they do about really winning back that loyalty. What are they going to do? And to start with, they're going to have to release shit that's good. And that's going to be a fucking challenge for Sega, because, again, as I said, they've been anything but. So whether it's new intellectual property, I don't think we can stomach another horrible Sega game. I mean, there's been so many horrible Sega games since the Dreamcast that I can't remember Sonic ever being good. That's how bad it is. If you throw enough shit at people, they're going to forget it was ever good. And honestly, that's been the case for me. So really curious to see where they go. Want to know what your guys' thoughts and opinions are. Do you believe in Sega? Do you believe Hajime? Can they turn Sega around? Can they win back the trust of you, me, and other consumers? We'll find out. And of course, we will update the video as they said about trying to do that. As always, guys, till the next video, cheers.